Everyone, welcome to Bath and to the conference, the convention. I'm Michael Tsarion, for those who have never heard or seen me before. It's actually only the second time that I've been speaking in Britain. Second presentation, second time in public here. So it's a great personal pleasure for me, and I really want to thank Karen also for inviting me to the event, which is in a wonderful setting, by the way. This is a tremendous history here, as you well know. I hope you get the time to take Daniel's tour around the town and familiarize yourself with the place if you haven't already. And actually, how many actually from the local area? A few, yeah. So most, and how many from outside? Oh, good, because it's a bit hard with the lights to see that. And I've personally been getting some good footage, for the upcoming film I'm doing, Architects of Control. So it's the architecture. And it's really a pleasure to see it. A lot of ancient history here. And Karen has chosen a great lineup of speakers for this event. Some of my personal favorites as well. And of course, these are some of the people that she's featured in her wonderful book, which is available downstairs. I'll try to read some quotes from the book a little bit later if I have the chance. And also, as a special, it was especially important that she dedicated the book to Patrick McGoohan, the creator of the Prisoner series. I have a picture here for those who maybe not familiar with him. Is that up there? Yeah, good. And this series, it had a great influence on my personal life, but I was walking downtown in Bath the other day and actually saw a corporate logo. Let me see if I can find it. And it absolutely would have made him cringe. I mean, it's a funny old world anyway, and you have to laugh just to keep sane. But this particular logo, let's take a look at this for a minute. Right? I am who I am because of everyone. Now, see, on paper that sounds marvelous, right? Very frou-frou, very trendy, very modern, very collectivist. And as I say, the guy would be turning in his grave, because that's what's happening in today's world. We're dealing with a very much, in fact, you could say that the whole dynamic comes down to the difference between the collective and the individual. And I assume that the people I'm addressing here in the audience today are aware of this, and that you're interested in these particular subjects, and the wider version of alternative research subjects, defines you, or at least it does in my eyes. That, you are aware of that and seeking for that level of individualism. Separation, because we are now living in a situation where the bricks for the global village are being created. And this may only, millions of people walk past these types of mottos, corporate advertisements every day. And that makes them feel fuzzy and warm subliminally. The subtextual messages behind terms like this make the vast majority of people feel good. And we have philosophers, we have entire philosophies from people like Friedrich Hegel who absolutely concluded. And then people like Sigmund Freud and others, basically confirming it in different language later on, that that's in fact what is going on, that there is no such thing as an individual at all. There may not even be anything as individual consciousness. There's only a social persona or social ego. And that's quite frightening. And it gives rise then to thoughts about, well, my goodness, maybe the McGoohans of the world, weren't entirely wrong. And that they were, on the contrary, on the ball. But another thing about shows like that, and from a British context, others as well, like Doctor Who and Blake 7, maybe from an American context, X-Files and V, and many, many others I could mention, films, documentaries. You'd wonder then, wouldn't you, that since 1960s or even the advent of television, why it is that with all these fantastic messages and scenarios and insights and mystical and metaphysical shows and programs, people don't change. It just doesn't get through, and yet you think in that medium, that would be the key medium. It's not necessarily didactic, it's not necessarily declarative, right? It's working with the right brain. How then with this, because not all television is negative, so you want to ask, wouldn't you, why is it that people remain the way they are? in a pretty much unconscious state. Why are the warnings and predictions of shows like that, and the insights that they offer, people just reduce it to fiction, as they've done with the works of Professor Tolkien and Professor Lewis and so many other works? One has to ask a question about that. Why remain indifferent? Why not fundamentally change? Is it because people really want freedom from freedom? Is it because they're scared to death of what it means to walk the Siddhartha road? Is it because they don't really want truth, justice, and freedom? Now that's a very hard question and controversial one to ask, but everyone here should be asking it, because what happens if the answer happens to be yes? What happens if that is in fact true? Well, then that makes the people here a very select group. And the point I'd like to make is then you better be applauding yourselves, because even to get this far is an enormous success, enormous advancement. It also means that you've probably realized that you are your own teacher and that you are your own pupil, which is a very big step as well. To break through that dynamic, to realize that you are your own priest or your own priestess. There's no teacher, there's nobody teaching you anything, and the fact that you've even got this far implies that you're kind of aware of that. You've brought yourself here, so applaud yourself. And, feel good about that particular fact. It's very necessary in a situation in the world in which we are, where there are unconscious people walking around, and I'm sorry to have to say that, but when you walk around, that's what I see in people's faces and eyes, is an absence, an avoidance, and an escapism, chronically. But from what? Knowledge? No, it's something deeper than that. And reminds me also to say that even the teachers that Karen has assembled here and that turn up at other conferences and so on, these individuals, when we listen to them, are we aware that it's not just intellectual stimulation, it's not just food for the brain? It's something much more. You may be hearing about history, you may be hearing about Egypt, you may be hearing about Atlantis. But we have to fundamentally understand there's something deeper than just the knowledge. And the people who've picked up the slack on their own time, they've been courageous, they've been brave, they've had to face the fact, unlike the masses we're talking about, that maybe it's true that every single thing that they've been taught from day one is lies, is falsehood. I have a quote here from, let me see if I can find it. It was actually Godfrey Higgins. Yeah. He was one of the great Victorian scholars, Godfrey Higgins. And he said here that almost all the latter part of my life has been spent unlearning the nonsense I learned in my youth. And that was in the 1900s. So this whole process, that's like almost the first stage, isn't it? That you have to deal with that. You have to have the courage, the mental and intellectual and emotional courage to accept that fact. A lot of people are not going to want to do that. They don't want to have come through and jumped through all the hoops and gone through all of the different academic experiences and learn how to go along to get along and sacrifice just to have merely social and professional approval. They don't want to reach the age of 30 or 40 and then be having to face the fact that maybe everything they know is wrong, or there's a matrix of lies out there, or an architecture of control to keep people in complete complicity and conformity. So again, congratulate yourselves if you've made that transition. But again, that's only part one of the movement. The next one, as I already mentioned, is the state in which you have to dispense basically with external authority. Put no one on a pedestal. In my philosophy, if you put somebody on a pedestal, expect a kick in the face, because that's exactly what you're going to get. In fact, I go further, being basically a sort of disciple of Ayn Rand, I'd say put yourself on a pedestal. If you're going to do that at all, stand up straight. Put yourself there. You are the teacher, you are the shaman, you are the creator, co-creator. And then probably the most important point of all is that we must understand that, okay, there's a nice infatuation with all of these subjects, it's just wonderful, and we know now that Discovery Channel, History Channel, and all sorts of mainstream things are co-opting a lot of this information. I was just in a bookstore again, I think it was Waterstones, down in the basement. You should go there. And you should, go there with objective eyes. And now you will see, a lot of books debunking history. the lies of history, and so on. You know, again, co-opting a lot of what has been going on in the alternative movement. They're not doing the same work, and they're not, when they debunk a particular aspect of history, of course, they're weak. They're not really offering the true solutions. In fact, some of them are doing worse. They're offering one set of, they're replacing one set of lies with another. But just the very fact that these kinds of books are now appearing shows you that there is a sea change taking place in the world. And therefore, even though that's all intriguing and everything, and it's infatuating, and there's more knowledge now than there ever has been before, and also the medium of gaining that knowledge is new. Now we have the internet, we have television, and all sorts of other electronic means of gathering incredible knowledge. But even though that is the case, one must never lose sight, at least in my work, because I never stop talking about consciousness and the war on consciousness, is that basically everything that you hear today and during the weekend here is absolutely ultimately about yourself. Because whether you realize it or not, and maybe this is what should be your homework for the weekend, if you don't mind me saying that, and that is to contemplate deeply on the fact that everything that you hear of this kind of subject matter is testament to the fact that you are now on holy ground. Probably the only holy ground that exists, because that doesn't lie with the religions of the world. That's part of that matrix of control, to make sure that you just don't have an understanding of selfhood. This knowledge that immediately, if you call it occult, if you permit me to use that word, and all I mean is esoteric, it is occult because it is actually sacred. And it's sacred because it has to do with your selfhood. In the early stages, you don't know that. It's intriguing. It's read this, read that, and pick up the sound bites and go from there. In the early stages, of course, one will not understand that. But the more mature person as they develop and they start asking these questions, and as they also start realizing how much they have to sacrifice in daily life to permit themselves to study this because of all of the backlashing and all of the resistance from family members and society. As you start to mature in the subject, you'll suddenly start to question, why do I even bothering with this? And it's at that point that maybe that voice will speak to you and say, but this is about your self-discovery. It's not just food for the mind, food for the brain. This is of paramount importance. Because in my work specifically, everything, the prime datum is consciousness. And if that doesn't change, then you may run around, forever like the Keystone Cops trying to make political and social change, and it will never happen. And I think that's also one of the reasons why people can't do that. It's one of the reasons why we see this escapism, because walking the Siddhartha road of selfhood is probably one of the hardest things you could possibly do. Self-work or soul work. And also don't forget that if it is true what I'm saying, that ultimately, although you're not in a physical church or a physical shrine or a physical ashram, by studying this material, you with it, when you read the works of the great minds throughout the history of the world, you are now, whether you like it or not, on holy ground. That means, does it not, that you have to have a different sense of gratitude and reverence then. And that again is the dividing line between people who can't pull that off. They're not aware of it. And so they're reading the sacred knowledge and they're studying the sacred knowledge, but slowly, 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 the tests are going to come, and then they're not going to be able to go any further. Because to open the door on this Siddhartha road is the reverence. The reverence is the thing that unlocks the door. And if you don't have it, eventually you will not be able to go any further, which I've seen in my own life has happened with people. Because in this game, we don't need to be worrying about CCTV cameras and surveillance from Big Brother. We need to be worrying about a higher form of surveillance. The surveillance of one's own higher self. That's what we really need to be aware of. Not in some negative way, of course. But very conscious that this is a very living and real and vital thing that has to do with your real purpose on this planet, your dharma. And one should never lose sight of that. And maybe over the time when we're listening to the scholars here, we should always bear that in mind. Because remember, in ancient days, Celtic mythology is full of it. So is most of the mythologies of the world. There were tests. There were trials. Read about King Arthur and any of the myths of the world, particularly the Celtic legends, they're full of it. But even today in various Eastern religions, in Taoism, right, Zen Buddhism, there's enormous tests and trials. And though we in the West today may not have to prove ourselves by walking over burning coals, or fighting minotaurs and labyrinths or whatever you want to way you want to look at it, there are still tests and trials of will, maybe a different order of tests and trials. And it won't take very long before we become familiar with what those are. And hopefully those will also be pointers that let you know that it's about selfhood. Why do you think it is, for instance, that the Freemasonic orders, and I include Knights Templars and Rosicrucians and all of these kinds of people, why do you think they have their hierarchies? Because they know exactly what I'm talking about. First, they have a certain tacit respect for history. That's one thing you must give them. They are preservers of ancient gnosis and knowledge. But the other one is that they understand that you just can't take the mugger off the street. You know, and just allow them access, you see, to sacred knowledge. And in one way that's understandable. Of course, they take it too far. And they lose sight of the fact that all this knowledge is actually in the keeping of all humanity. It's not for an elect or specific group in that obvious way. But there's a price that comes with being a seeker after truth. From the emails that I get, from the communiques that I get, of course you get a lot of different kinds of things. But I often notice that there's a great passion in the people, especially from the younger, and they wish that they could just completely dive into this material. Not even have to work and not have any of those worries. So that they could really jump in and absorb it, and have nothing else going on in their lives except that. To be able to travel around, to be able to study endlessly. And that is incredible. But of course, the reality is that you can't. We have to have one foot in the world and one foot in that other holy place. And that is, again, a major struggle, as you well know. It's not too easy. And if I was to make this into a sermon, I would probably begin it by saying, let's be grateful for what we're about to receive. But of course, I'll not do that on you. It's not a sermon. It's just a simple, actually, acknowledgement of, again, your own exceptionality in a way. And it's a way of me saying, welcome to these things. Because I know that probably friends or even yourselves probably even decided, should I go, should I not? The traffic, the cost, or, it's far away. I mean, did anybody feel that way? Was there anyone here who did actually have in two minds whether to even come? You'll admit that? I mean, it's good. Let's admit this. If it was difficult, if those thoughts came up. But you made the choice. And that it needs to be acknowledged and is a good thing. It's a very good thing. And I think the last thing I'll say before we move on, I won't take up too much of your time here, is that probably because of religion and just the entire matrix of confusion and lies and trickery that we've got in the world today, we probably do, in fact, have a very misgiven understanding of what is the self and what is the soul. So my parting words to you would be, maybe we need to completely burn down, deconstruct all the ideas that we have about the soul. And my last point really will be that what happens, we've been talking about knowledge being sort of the road to selfhood. What happens if the self and the soul is, as the psychologist Thomas Saz said, not something you find and not something that you've been given, but something that you create here in this world, now, in this life, through your experience? Now that gives a lot of pause, because what happens if that is the case? That you're not already born with what we call soul. Maybe that's lies, more deception. But that you have to create it while you're here, through your experience. Look at the responsibility that comes with that. One person may have gratitude and reverence towards that and take on the work. Another person may be deadly afraid to do that. And does that not explain then, perhaps, the addiction and the escapism and the avoidance and all the other sorts of nonsense that you see in the world? If this in fact turns out to be the case. That not only is this sort of interest in these alternative subjects about selfhood, but it might even be even more important than that. You might be in the very process of creating your soul, your spirit, your sense of selfhood. There's people in the gulags who will confirm exactly what I've said, so I know I'm on strong ground here. And I have deconstructed all those other models. And I don't believe them anymore. And so this then becomes a tremendous, study, an amazing thing. And that's why with that comes an optimism and a gratitude and a reverence and a feeling that this matters. It's very, very vital. It's very, very important. Because to not do it is to not only enslave yourself, it's to enslave the entire world, which is what I think Patrick McGowan was really trying to say. And when it comes to his wonderful book, one might really question, as I've done, what is the greatest one-liner in that book? There are so many. I'm not a number, I'm a free man. Can I see a larger map? No. This is all you get, the village. Or was that other one? Questions are a burden and answers a prison for oneself. Or who is number one? What's subtextually behind that? Who is number one? Is number one an external, all-seeing presence? Or is number one about selfhood? What was he talking about in the first and last episode of that? Was it an indication of that he had brought all of this into existence? He was in fact number one? Is it, we're all pawns, my dear? And we are literally just that and have no free will whatsoever? We're just doomed to follow the collective, like you saw, this statement, that's it. That's all, you should be secure. That's enough, that makes you secure. Or is it that famous line, I will not be pushed, filed, stamped, indexed, briefed, debriefed, or numbered? My life is my own. And my personal favorite is everyone votes for a dictator. But anyway, I'd like to finish with a quote from Karen's wonderful book. And forgive me if you've heard this before. I just think it needs to be reread. And it's from Aldous Huxley, from Brave New World Revisited, and it's this. It is perfectly possible for a man to be out of prison, and yet not free, to be under no physical constraint, and yet to be a psychological captive, compelled to think, feel, and act as the representatives of the national state or of some private interest within the nation wants him to think, feel, and act. The nature of psychological compulsion is such that those who act under it or under constraint remain under the impression that they are acting on their own initiative. The victim of mind manipulation does not know that he is a victim. To him, the walls of his prison are invisible, and he believes himself to be free. That he is not free is apparent only to other people, because his servitude is strictly objective. Anyway, again, thanks for being here and thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy the conference. Make sure you applaud yourselves. I meant it physically. Give yourselves a round of applause.